Novel The Kite Runner by Khalid Hosseini. Chapter number 4. In 1933, the year Baba was born and the year Zahir Shah began his 40-year reign of Afghanistan. Two brothers, young men from a wealthy and reputable family in Kabul, got behind the wheel of their father's Ford Roadster. High on hashish and mashed on French wine, they struck and killed a Hazara husband and wife on the road to Pagman. The police brought the somewhat contrite young man and the dead couple's 5-year-old orphan boy before my grandfather, who was highly regarded judge and a man of impeccable reputation. After hearing the brothers' account and their father's plea for mercy, my grandfather ordered the two young men to go to Kandahar at once and enlist in the army for 1 year. This despite the fact that their family had somehow managed to obtain them exemption from the draft. Their father argued but not too vehemently, and in the end everyone agreed that the punishment had been perhaps harsh but fair. As for the orphan, my grandfather adopted him into his own household and told the other servant to tutor him, but to be kind to him. That boy was Ali. Ali and Baba grew up together as childhood playmates, at least until polio crippled Ali's leg, just like Hassan and I grew up a generation later. Baba was always telling us about the mischief he and Ali used to cause, and Ali would shake his head and say, "But Agha Saab, tell them who was the architect of the mischief and who the poor laborer." Baba would laugh and throw his arm around Ali, but in none of his stories did Baba ever refer to Ali as his friend. The curious thing was, I never thought of Hassan and me as friends either, not in the usual sense. Anyhow, never mind that we taught each other to ride a bicycle with no hands or to build a fully functional homemade camera out of a cardboard box. Never mind that we spent entire winters flying kites running. Kites. Never mind that to me the face of Afghanistan is that of a boy with a thin boned frame, a shaved head, and a low set ears, a boy with a Chinese doll face, perpetually lit by a hair lipped smile. Never mind any of those things because history is not easy to overcome, neither in religion. In the end, I was a Pashtun and he was a Hazara. I was Sunni and he was Shia, and nothing was ever going to change that. Nothing. But we were kids who had learned to crawl together and know history. Ethnicity, society, or religion was going to change that either. I spent most of first 12 years of my life playing with Hassan. Sometimes my entire childhood seems like one long lazy summer day with Hassan, chasing each other between tangles of trees in my father's yard, playing hide and seek, cops and robbers, cowboys and Indians, insect torture with our growing achievement undeniable. Time we plucked the stinger off a bee and tied a string around the poor thing to yank it back every time it took flight. We chased the Kochi, the nomads who passed through Kabul on their way to the mountains of the north. We would hear their caravans approaching our neighborhood. The mewing of their sheep, the baying of their goats, the jingle of bells around their camels' neck. We would run outside to watch the caravans plod through our street, men with dusty weather-beaten faces and women dressed in long, colorful shawls, beads, and silver bracelets around their wrists and ankles. We hurried pebbles at their goats. We squirted water on their mules. I would make Hassan sit on the wall of ailing corn and fire pebbles with his slingshot at the camel's rears. We saw our first western together, Rio Bravo with John Wayne, at the cinema park across the street from my favorite bookstore. I remember begging Baba to take us to Iran so we could meet John Wayne. Baba burst out in the gills of his deep-throated laughter, a sound not unlike a truck engine reviving up, and when he could talk again, explained to us the concept of voice dubbing. Hassan and I were stunned, dazed. John Wayne did not really speak Farsi and he was not Iranian. He was American, just like the friendly long-haired men and women we always saw hanging out in Kabul dressed in their tattered, brightly colored shirt. We saw Rio Bravo 3 times, but we saw our favorite western, the magnificent 713 times. With each viewing, we cried at the end when the Mexican kids buried Charles Bronson, who, as it turned out, was not Iranian either. We took strolls in the musty smelling bazaars of Sher Nau section of Kabul or the new city west of the Wazir Akbar Khan district. We talked about whatever film we had just seen and walked amid the bustling crowds of bazaris. We snacked our way among the merchants and the beggars, wandered through narrow alleys crammed with rows of tiny, tightly packed stalls. Baba gave us each a weekly allowance of 10 Afghanis, and we spent it on warm Coca-Cola and rose water ice cream topped with crushed pistachio. During the school year, we had a daily routine. By the time I dragged myself out of the bed and lumbered to the bathroom, Hassan had already washed up, prayed the morning namaz with Ali, and prepared my breakfast. Hot black tea with 3 sugar cubes and a slice of toast, naan topped with my favorite sour cherry marmalade, all neatly placed on the dining table while I ate and complained about homework. Hassan made my bed, polished my shoes, ironed my outfit for the day, packed my books and pencils. I could hear him singing to the himself in the foyer as he ironed, singing old Hazara songs in his nasal voice. Then Baba and I drove off in his black Ford Mustang, a car that drew envious looks everywhere because it was the same car Steve McQueen had driven in Bullet, a film that played in one theater for 6 months. Hassan stayed home and helped Alif with day's chores, hand washing dirty clothes and hanging them to dry in the yard, sweeping the floors, buying fresh naan from the bazaar, marinating meat for dinner, watering the lawn. After school, Hassan and I met up, grabbed a book, and trotted up a bowl-shaped hill just north of my father's property in Wazir Akbar Khan. There was an old abandoned cemetery atop the hill with rows of unmarked headstones and tangles of brushwood clogging the aisles. Season of rain and snow had turned the iron gate rusty and left the cemetery's low white stone walls in the decay. There was a pomegranate tree near the entrance to the cemetery. One summer day, I used one of Ali's kitchen knives to carve our names on it, Amir and Hassan, the Sultans of Kabul. Those words made it formal. The tree was ours. After school, Hassan and I climbed its branches and snatched its blood red pomegranates. After we had eaten the fruit and wiped our hand on the grass, I would read to Hassan, sitting cross-legged, sunlight and shadows of pomegranate leaves dancing on his face. Hassan absently plucked blades of grass from the ground as I read him stories he could not read for himself. That Hassan would grow up illiterate like Ali and most Hazaras had been decided the minute he had been born, perhaps even the moment he had been conceived in Snowbird's unwelcoming womb. After all, what use did a servant have for the written word? But despite his illiteracy, or maybe because of it, Hassan was drawn to the mystery of words. Seduced by a secret word of forbidden to him, I read him poems and stories, sometimes riddles, though I stopped reading those when I saw he was far better at solving them than I was. So I read him unchallenging things like the misadventures of the bumbling Mullah Nasiruddin and his donkey. We sat for hours under the tree, sat there until the sun faded in the west, and still Hassan insisted we had enough daylight for one more story, one more chapter. My favorite part of reading to Hassan was when we came across a big word that he did not know. I could tease him, expose him ignorance. One time I was reading him a Mullah Nasiruddin story and he stopped me. What does that word mean? Which one? Imbecile. You don't know what it means? I said, grinning. Nah, Miraga, but it's such a common word. Still, I don't know it. If he felt the sting of my tease, his smiling face didn't show it. Well, everyone in my school knows what it means, I said. Let's see. Imbecile, it means smart, intelligent. I will use it in a sentence for you. When it comes to the words, Hassan is an imbecile. Ah, he said, nodding. I would always feel guilty about it later. so I could try to make up for it by giving him one of my old shirt or a broken toy. I would tell myself that was immense enough for a harmless prank. Hassan's favorite book by far was the Shahnama, the 10th century epic of ancient Persian heroes. He liked all of the chapters, the Shahs of old, Faridun, Zal, and Rudaba, but his favorite story and mine was Rustam and Sorab, the tale of the great warrior Rustam and his fleet-footed horse, Raksh. Rustam mortally wounds his valiant nemesis Sorab in battle only to discover that Sorab is his long lost son. Stricken with grief, Rustam hears his son dying words, "If thou art indeed my father, then hast thou stained by thy sword in the life blood of thy son, and thou didn't it of thine abstency. For I sought to turn thee unto love, and I implored of thee thy name. For I thought to behold in thee the tokens recounted of my mother, but I appealed unto thy heart in vain, and now is the time gone for meeting. Read it again, please, Amir Aga. Hassan would say. Sometimes tears pooled in Hassan's eyes as I read him this passage, and I always wondered whom he wept for the grief-stricken Rustam who tears his clothes and covers his head with ashes, or the dying Sorab who only longed for his father's love. Personally, I could not see the tragedy in Rustam's fate. After all, did not all fathers in their secret hearts harbor a desire to kill their sons? One day in July 1973, I played another little trick on Hassan. I was reading to him and suddenly I strayed from the written story. I pretended I was reading from the book, flipping pages regularly, but I had abandoned the text altogether, taken over the story, and made up my own. Hassan, of course, was oblivious to this. To him, the words on the page were a scramble of codes, indecipherable, mysterious. Words were secret doorways, and I held all the keys. After I started to ask him if he could like the story, a giggle rising in my throat when Hassan began to clap. "What are you doing?" I said. "That was the best story you have read me in a long time," he said, still clapping. I laughed. "Really, really, that's fascinating," I muttered. "I mean it too. This was wholly unexpected." "Are you sure, Hassan?" He was still clapping. It was great, Amir Aga. Will you read me more of it tomorrow?" "Fascinating," I repeated, a little breathless, feeling like a man who discovers a buried treasure in his own backyard. Walking down the hill, thoughts were exploding in my head like the fireworks at Chaman. "Best story you have read. Have read me in a long time," he had said. I had read him a lot of stories. Hassan was asking me something. What? I said. "What does that mean, fascinating?" I laughed, clutched him in a hug, and planted a kiss on his cheek. "What was that for?" he said, startled, blushing. I gave him a friendly, short smile. "You are a prince, Hassan. You are a prince, and I love you." That same night, I wrote my first short story. It took me 30 minutes. It was a dark little tale about a man who found a magic cup and learned that if he wept into the cup, his tears turned into pearls. But even though he had always been poor, he was a happy man and rarely shed a tear, so he found ways to make himself sad so that his tears could make him rich. As the pearls piled up, so did his greed grow. The story ended with the man sitting on a mountain of pearls, knife in hand, weeping helplessly into the cup with his beloved wife's slain body in his arm. That evening, I climbed the stairs and walked into Baba's smoking room. In my hands, that two sheets of paper on which I had scribbled the story. Baba and Rahim Khan were smoking pipes and sipping brandy when I came in. "What is it, Amir?" Baba said, reclining on the sofa and lacing his hands behind his head. Blue smoke swirled around his face. His glare made my throat feel dry. I cleared it and told him I had written a story. Baba nodded and gave a thin smile that conveyed little more than faint interest. "Well, that's very good, isn't it?" he said, then nothing more. He just looked at me through the cloud of smoke. I probably stood there for under a minute, but to this day it was one of the longest minutes of my life, second plodded by, each separated from the next by an eternity. Air grew heavy, damp, almost solid. I was breathing bricks. Baba went on staring me down and didn't offer to read. As always, it was Rahim Khan who rescued me. He held out his hand and favored me with a smile that had nothing faint about it. May I have it, Amir Jan? I would very much like to read it. Baba hardly ever used the term of endearment Jan when he addressed me. Baba shrugged and stood up. He looked relieved as if he too had been rescued by Shah Khan. Yes, give it to Kaka Rahim. I am going upstairs to get ready, and with that, he left the room. Most days I worshipped Baba with an intensity approaching the religious, but right then I wished I could open my veins and drain his cursed blood from my body. An hour later, as the evening sky dimmed, the two of them drove off in my father's car to attend a party. On his way out, Rahim Khan hunkered before me and handed me my story and another folded piece of paper. He flashed a smile and winked, "For you read it later." Then he paused and added a single word. Dad did more to encourage me to pursue writing than any compliment any editor has ever paid me. That word was bravo. When they left, I sat on my bed and wished Rahim Khan had been my father. Then I thought of Baba and his great big chest and how good it felt when he held me against it, how he smelled of brute in the morning and how his beard tickled my face. I was overcome with such sudden guilt that I bolted to the bathroom and vomited in the sink. Later that night, curled up in bed, I read Rahim Khan's note over and over. It read like this: Amir Jan, I enjoyed your story very much. MashaAllah, God has granted you a special talent. It is now your duty to hone that talent because you, a person who wastes his God-given talent, is a donkey. You have written your story with sound grammar and interesting style, but the most impressive thing about your story is that it has irony. You may not even know that what that word means, but you will someday. It is something that some writers reach for their entire careers and never attain. You have achieved it with your first story. My door is and always will be open to you, Amir Jan. I shall hear any story you have to tell. Bravo, your friend Rahim. Buoyed by Rahim Khan's note, I grabbed the story and hurried downstairs to the foyer where Ali and Hassan were sleeping on a mattress. That was the only time they slept in the house. When Baba was away and Ali had to watch over me, I shook Hassan awake and asked him if he wanted to hear a story. He rubbed his sleep-clogged eyes and stretched. Now, what time is it? Never mind the time. This is very special story. I wrote it myself, I whispered, hoping not to wake Ali. Hassan's face brightened. Then I have to hear it, he said, already pulling the blanket off him. I read to him in the living room by the marble fireplace. No playful straying from the words this time. This was about me. Hassan was the perfect audience in many ways, totally immersed in the tale, his face shifting with the changing tones in the story. When I read the last sentence, he made a muted clapping sound with his hand. MashaAllah, Amir Agha, bravo, he was beaming. You liked it? I said, getting my second taste, and how sweet it was of a positive review. Someday, inshallah, you will be a great writer, Hassan said, and all the people all over the world will read your stories. You exaggerate, Hassan, I said, loving him for it. No, you will be great and famous, he insisted. Then he paused as if on the verge of adding something. He weighed his word and cleared his throat. But will you permit me to ask a question about the story? He said shyly. Of course. Well, he started, broke off. Tell me, Hassan, I said. I smiled, though suddenly the insecure writer in me was not too sure he wanted to hear it. Well, he said, if I may ask, why did the man kill his wife? In fact, why did he ever have to feel sad to shed tears? Could not he have just smelled an onion? I was stunned. That particular point, so obvious, it was utterly stupid, hadn't even occurred to me. I moved my lips soundlessly. It appeared that on the same night I had learned about one of writing objectives, irony. I would also be introduced to one of its pitfalls, the plot hole, taught by Hassan of all people. Hassan, who could not read and had never written a single word in his entire life. A voice cold and dark suddenly whispered in my ear. What does he know, that illiterate Hazara? He will never be anything but a cook. How dare he criticize you? Well, I began, but I never got to finish that sentence because suddenly Afghanistan changed forever. Chapter number 5. Something roared like a thunder. The earth shook a little and we heard the rat a tat tat of gunfire. Father, Hassan cried. We sprung to our feet and raced out of the living room. We found Ali hobbling frantically across the foyer. Father, what's that sound? Hassan yelped, his hand outstretched towards Ali. Ali wrapped his arms around us. A white light flash lit the sky in silver. It flashed again and was followed by a rapid staccato of gunfire. They are hunting ducks, Ali said in hoarse voice. They hunt ducks at night, don't be afraid. A siren went off in the distance. Somewhere glass shattered and someone shouted. I heard people on the street jolted from sleep and probably still in their pajamas with ruffled hair and puffy eyes. Hassan was crying. Ali pulled him close, clutched him with tenderness. Later, I would tell myself I had not felt envious of Hassan, not at all. We stayed huddled that way until the early hours of morning. The shootings and explosions had lasted less than an hour, but they had frightened us badly because none of us had ever heard gunshots in the street. They were foreign sound to us then. The generation of Iwan children whose ears would know nothing but the sound of bombs and gunfire was not yet born. Huddled together in the dining room and waiting for the sun to rise. None of us had any notion that a way of life had ended. Our way of life, if not quite yet, then at least it was the beginning of the end. The end of the official end would come first in April 1978 with the communist coup d'etat, and then in December 1979 when Russian tanks would roll into the very same streets where Hassan and I played, bringing the death of the Afghanistan I knew and marking the start of a still ongoing era of bloodletting. Just before sunrise, Baba's car peeled into the driveway, his door slammed shut, and his running footsteps pounded the stair. Then he appeared in the doorway, and I saw something in his face, something I did not recognize right away because I would never seen it before. Fear. Amir Hassan, he exclaimed as he ran to us, opening his arm wide. They blocked all the roads, and the telephone didn't work. I was so worried. We let him wrap us in the arms, and for a brief, insane moment, I was glad about whatever had happened that night. They were not shooting ducks after all. As it turned out, they had not shot much of anything that night of July 17, 1973. Kabul awoke the next morning to find that the monarchy was a thing of the past. The king Zahir Shah was away in Italy in his absence. His cousin Daud Khan had ended the king's 40-year reign with a bloodless coup. I remember Hassan and I crouching that next morning outside my father's study as Baba and Rahim Khan sipped black tea and listened to breaking news of the coup on Radio Kabul. Amir Aga, Hassan whispered. I said, what? What's a republic? I shrugged. I don't know. On Baba's radio, they were saying that word republic over and over again. Amir Aga, what? Does republic mean father and I will have to move away? I don't think so, I whispered back. Hassan considered this. Amir Aga, what? I don't want them to send me and father away. I smiled. But you donkey. No one sending you away. Amir Aga, what? Do you want to climb onto our tree? My smile broadened. That was another thing about Hassan. He always knew when to say the right thing. The news on the radio was getting pretty boring. Hassan went to his shack to get ready and I ran upstairs to grab a book. Then I went to the kitchen, stuffed my pockets with handful of pine nuts and ran outside to find Hassan waiting for me. We burst through the front gates and headed for the hill. We crossed the residential street and were trekking through a barren path of rough land that led to the hill when suddenly a rock struck Hassan in the back. We whirled around and my heart dropped. Asif and two of his friends, Wali and Kamal, were approaching us. Asif was the son of one of my father's friend Mahmood, an airline pilot. His family lived a few streets south of our home in a posh, high-walled compound with palm tree. If you were a kid living in the Wazir Akbar Khan section of Kabul, you knew about Asif and his famous stainless steel brass knuckles. Hopefully not through personal experience, born to a German mother and Afghan father. The blonde blue-eyed Asif over the other kids, his well-earned reputation for savagery preceded him on the streets. Flanked by his obeying friends, he walked the neighborhood like a Khan strolling through his land with his eager to please entourage. His word was law, and if you needed a little legal education, then those brass knuckles were just the right teaching tool. I saw him use those knuckles once on a kid from the Kartik Char district. I will never forget how Asif's blue eyes glinted with a light not entirely sane, and how he grinned as he pummeled that poor kid unconscious. Some of the boys in Wazir Akbar Khan had nicknamed him Asif Goshkhor or Asif the Ear Eater. Of course, none of those dared utter it to his face unless they wished to suffer the same fate as the poor kid who had unwittingly inspired that nickname when he had fought Asif over a kite and ended up fishing his right ear from a muddy gutter. Years later, I learned an English word for the creature that Asif was a word for which a good Farsi equivalent does not exist. Sociopath. Of all the neighborhood boys who tortured Ali, Asif was by far the most relentless. He was in fact the originator of the Bablu Jeer. Hey Babalu, who did you eat today? Who? Huh. Come on, Bablu, give a smile. And on days when he felt particularly inspired, he spiced up by his badgering a little. Hey, you flat-nosed Bablu, who did you eat today? Tell us, you slant-eyed donkey. Now he was walking toward us, hands on his hips, his sneakers kicking up little puffs of dust. Good morning, Kunis, Asif exclaimed, waving fag. That was another of his favorite insults. Hassan retreated behind me as the three older boys closed in. They stood before us, three tall boys dressed in a jeans and t-shirt, towering over us all. Asif crossed his thick arms on his chest, a savage sort of grin on his lips. Not for the first time it occurred to me that Asif might not be entirely sane. It also occurred to me how lucky I was to have Baba as my father, the sole reason I believe. Asif had mostly refrained from harassing me too much. He tipped his chin to Hassan. Hey, flat nose, he said. How is Babalu? Hassan said nothing and crept another step behind me. You heard the news, boys? Asif said, his grin never faltering. The king is gone. Good riddance. Long live the president. My father knows Daud Khan. Did you know that, Amir? So does my father. I said in reality, I had no idea if that was true or not. So does my father. Asif mimicked me in a winning voice. Kamal and Wali cackled in unison. I wish Baba were there. Well, Daud Khan dined at our house last year. Asif went on. How do you like that, Amir? I wondered if anyone would hear us scream in this remote path of land. Baba's house was a good kilometer away. I wished we had stayed at the house. Do you know what I will tell Daud Khan the next time he comes to our house for dinner? Asif said. I am going to have a little chat with him, man to man, Mard to Mard. Tell him what I told my mother about Hitler. Now there was a leader, a great leader, a man with vision. I will tell Daud Khan to remember that if they had let Hitler finish what he had started, the world be a better place now. Baba says Hitler was crazy, that he ordered a lot of innocent people killed. I heard myself say before I could clamp a hand on my mouth. Asif snickered. He sounds like my mother and she is German. She should know better, but then they want you to believe that, don't they? They don't want you to know the truth. I did not know who they were or what truth they were hiding, and I did not want to find out. I wished I had not said anything. I wished again I had looked up and see Baba coming up the hill. But you have to read the books. They don't give out in school. Asif said, I have, and my eyes have been opened. Now I have a vision and I am going to share it with our new president. Do you know what it is? I shook my head. He could tell me anyway. Asif always answered his own questions. His blue eyes flicked to Hassan. Afghanistan is the land of Pashtuns. It always has been, always will be. We are the true Afghans, the pure Afghans, not this flat nose here. His people pollute our homeland, our watan. They dirty our blood. They made us weeping grandiose gesture with his hand. Afghanistan for Pashtun. I said that's my vision. Asif shifted his gaze to me again. He looked like someone coming out of a good dream. Too late for Hitler, he said, but not for us. He reached for something from the back pocket of his jeans. I will ask the president to do what the king did not have the Kuwait to do, to rid Afghanistan of all the dirty Hazaras. Just let us go, Asif, I said, hating the way my voice trembled. We are not bothering you. Oh, you are bothering me, Asif said, and I saw with a sinking heart what he had fished out of his pocket. Of course, his stainless steel brass knuckles sparkled in the sun. You are bothering me very much. In fact, you bother me more than this Hazara here. How can you talk to him, play with him, let him touch you? He said, his voice dripping with disgust. Wali and Kamal nodded and grunted in agreement. Asif narrowed his eyes, shook his head. When he spoke again, he sounded as baffled as he looked. How can you call him your friend? But he is not my friend. I am almost blurted. He is my servant. Had I really thought that? Of course I had not. I had not. I treated Hassan well, just like a friend, better, even more like a brother. But if so, then why, when Baba's friend came to visit with their kids, didn't ever include Hassan in our games? Why did I play with Hassan only when no one else was around? Asif slipped on the brass knuckles, gave me an icy look. You are part of the problem, Amir. If idiots like you and your father didn't take these people in, we would get rid of them by now. They would all just go rot in Hazara Jat where they belong. You are disgrace to Afghanistan. I looked in his crazy eyes and saw that meant it. He really meant to hurt me. Asif raised his fist and came for me. There was a flurry of rapid movement behind me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Hassan bend down and stand up quickly. Asif's eye flicked to something behind me and widened with surprise. I saw that same look of astonishment on Kamal and Wali's faces as they too saw what had happened behind me. I turned and came face to face with Hassan's slingshot. Hassan had pulled the wide elastic band all the way back. In the cup was a rock the size of a walnut. Hassan held the slingshot pointed directly at Asif's face. His hand trembled with the strain of the pulled elastic band, and beads of sweat and erupted on his brow. Please leave us alone, Agha, Hassan said in flat tone. He had referred to Asif as Aga, and I wondered briefly what it must be like to live with such an ingrained sense of one's place in a hierarchy. Asif gritted his teeth. Put it down, you motherless Hazara. Please leave us be, Aga, Hassan said. Asif smiled. Maybe you did not notice, but there are 3 of us and 2 of you. Hassan shrugged. To an outsider, he did not look scared, but Hassan's face was my earliest memory, and I knew all of its subtle nuances, knew each and every twitch and flicker that ever rippled across it. And I said that he was scared. He was scared plenty. You are right, Aga, but perhaps you did not notice that I am the one holding the slingshot. If you make a move, they will have to change your nickname from Asif the Ear Eater to One-Eyed Asif, because I have this rock pointed at your left eye. He said this so flatly that even I had to strain to hear the fear that I knew hide under that calm voice. Asif's mouth twitched. Wali and Kamal watched this exchange with something akin to fascination. Someone had challenged their god, humiliated him, and worst of all, that someone was a skinny Hazara. Asif looked from the rock to Hassan. He searched Hassan's face intently. What he found in it must have convinced him of the seriousness of Hassan's intentions, because he lowered his fist. You should know something about me, Hazara, Asif said gravely. I am a very patient person. This does not end today, believe me. He turned to me. This is not the end of you either, Amir. Someday I will make you face me one on one. Asif retreated a step. His disciples followed. Your Hazara made a big mistake today, Amir, he said. Then they turned around, walked away. I watched them walk down through the hill and disappear behind a wall. Hassan was trying to tuck the slingshot in his waist with a pair of trembling hands. His mouth curled up into something that was supposed to be a reassuring smile. It took him 5 tries to tie the string of his trousers. Neither one of us said much of anything as we walked home in trepidation, certain that Asif and his friends would ambush us every time we turned a corner. They didn't, and that should have comforted us a little, but it did not at all. For the next couple of years, the world economic development and the reform danced on a lot of lips in Kabul. The constitutional monarchy had been abolished, replaced by a republic led by a president of the republic. For a while, a sense of rejuvenation and purpose swept across the land. People spoke of women's rights and modern technology, and for the most part, even though a new leader lived in Arg, the royal palace in Kabul, life went on as before. People went to work Saturday through Thursday and gathered for picnics on Friday in parks on the banks of Ghargha Lake, in the garden of Pagman. Multicolored buses and lorries filled with passengers load through the narrow street of Kabul, led by the constant shouts of the driver assistant who straddled the vehicle's rear bumpers and yelped direction to the driver in their thick Kabuli accent. On Eid, the 3 days of celebration after the holy month of Ramadan, Kabulis dressed in their best and newest clothes and visited their family. People hugged and kissed and greeted each other with Eid Mubarak, Happy Eid. Children opened gifts and played with dyed hair, hard-boiled eggs. Early that following winter of 1974, Hassan and I were playing in the yard one day, building a snow fort when Ali called him in. Hassan, Agha Sahib wants to talk to you. He was standing by the front door, dressed in white, hands tucked under his armpit, breath puffing from his mouth. Hassan and I exchanged a smile. He had been waiting for his call all the day. It was Hassan's birthday. What is it, father? Do you know? Will you tell us? Hassan said. His eyes were gleaming. Ali shrugged. Agha Sahab hasn't discussed it with me. Come on, Ali, tell us. I pressed. Is it drawing book? Maybe a new pistol? Like Hassan, Ali was incapable of laying. Every year he pretended not to know what Baba had bought Hassan or me for our birthdays, and every year his eyes betrayed him and we coaxed the goods out of him. This time, though, it seemed he was telling the truth. Baba never missed Hassan's birthday. For a while he used to ask Hassan what he wanted, but he gave up doing that because Hassan was always too modest to actually suggest a present. So every winter Baba picked something out himself. He bought him a Japanese toy truck one year, an electric locomotive and train track set another year. The previous year Baba had surprised Hassan with a leather cowboy hat just like the one Clint Eastwood wore in The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, which had unseated The Magnificent Seven as our favorite western. That whole winter, Hassan and I took turns wearing that hat and belted out the film's famous music as we climbed mounds of snow and shot each other dead. We took off our gloves and removed our snow-laden boots at the front door. When we stepped into the foyer, we found Baba sitting by the wood-burning cast iron stove with a short, balding Indian man dressed in a brown suit and red tie. Hassan, Baba said, smiling coyly, meet your birthday present. Hassan and I traded blank looks. There was no gift wrap box inside, no bag, no toy, just Ali standing behind us and Baba with this slight Indian fellow who looked a little like a mathematics teacher. The Indian man in the brown suit smiled and offered Hassan his hand. I am Dr. Kumar, he said. It is a pleasure to meet you. He spoke Farsi with a thick, rolling Hindi accent. Salaam alaikum, Hassan said uncertainly. He gave a polite tip of the head, but his eyes sought his father behind him. Ali moved closer and set his hand on Hassan's shoulder. Baba met Hassan's weary and puzzled eyes. I summoned Dr. Kumar from New Delhi. Dr. Kumar is a plastic surgeon. Do you know what that is? The Indian man, Dr. Kumar said. Hassan shook his head. He looked to me for help, but I shrugged. All I knew was that you went to a surgeon to fix you when you had appendicitis. I knew this because one of my classmates had died of it last year before, and the teacher had told us they had waited too long to take him to surgeon. We both looked to Ali, but of course with him you could never tell. His face was impassive as ever, though something sober had melted into his eyes. Well, Dr. Kumar said, my job is to fix things on people's bodies, sometimes their faces. Oh, Hassan said. He looked from Dr. Kumar to Baba to Ali. His hand touched his upper lip. Oh, he said again. It's an unusual present, I know, Baba said, and probably not what you had in mind, but this present will last you forever. Oh, Hassan said. He licked his lips, cleared his throat. Agha Sahib will It will it nothing doing. Dr. Kumar intervened, smiling kindly. It will not hurt you one bit. In fact, I will give you a medicine and you will not remember a thing. Oh, Hassan said. He smiled back with relief, a little relief anyway. I was not scared, Agha Sahib. I just Hassan might have been fooled, but I was not. I knew that when doctors said it would not hurt, that's when you knew you were in trouble. I remembered my circumcision that the year prior the doctor had given me the same line. Ray assured me it would not hurt one bit, but when the numbing medicine wore off later that night, it felt like someone had pressed a red hot coal to my loins. Why Baba waited until I was 10 to have me circumcised was beyond me, and one of the things I will never forgive him for. I wished I too had some kind of scar that would begat Baba's sympathy. It was not fair. Hassan had not done anything to earn Baba's affections. He had just been born with that stupid hair lip. The surgery went well. We were all a little shocked when the first removed the bandages, but kept our smile on just as Dr. Kumar had instructed us. It was not easy because Hassan's upper lip was a grotesque mesh of swollen raw tissue. I expected Hassan to cry with horror when the nurse handed him the mirror. Ali held his hand as Hassan took a long, thoughtful look into it. He muttered something I did not understand. I put my ear to his mouth. He whispered it again. Tashakkur, thank you. Then his lips twisted, and that time I knew just what he was doing. He was smiling just as he had emerging from his mother's womb. The swelling subsided and the wound healed with time. Soon it was just a jagged line running up from his lip. His lip, but the following winter it was only a faint scar, which was ironic because that was the winter that Hassan stopped smiling. Chapter number 6. Winter. Here is what I do on the first day of the snowfall every year. I step out of the house early in the morning, still in my pajamas, hugging my arms against the chill. I find the driveway, my father's car, the walls, the trees, the rooftops, and the hills buried under a foot of snow. I smile. The sky is seamless and blue, the snow so white, my eyes burn. I shovel a handful of the fresh snow into my mouth, listen to the muffled stillness broken only by the cawing of crows. I walk down the front step barefoot and call for Hassan to come out and see. Winter was every kid's favorite season in Kabul, at least those whose fathers could afford to buy a good iron stove. The reason was simple. They shut down school for the icy season. Winter to me was the end of long division and naming the capital of Bulgaria and the start of 3 months of playing cards by the stove with Hassan. Free Russian movies on Tuesday mornings at cinema parks, sweet turnip korma, our rice for lunch after a morning of building a snowman, and kites, of course, flying kites and running them. For a few unfortunate kids, winter did not spell the end of the school year. There were the so-called voluntary winter courses. No kid I knew ever volunteered to go to these classes. Parents, of course did the volunteering for them. Fortunately for me, Baba was not one of them. I remember one kid Ahmed, who lived across the street from us. His father was some kind of doctor. I think Ahmed had epilepsy and always wore a wool vest and thick black rimmed glasses. He was one of Asif's regular victims. Every morning I watched from my bedroom window as their Hazara servant shoveled snow from the driveway, cleared the way for the black Opel. I made a point of watching Ahmed and his father get into the car. Ahmed in his wool vest and winter coat, his school bag filled with books and pencils. I waited until they pulled away, turned the corner, then I slipped back into the bed in my flannel pajamas. I pulled the blanket to my chin and watched the snow-capped hills in the north through the window. Watched them until I drifted back to the sleep. I loved winter time in Kabul. I loved it for the soft pattering of snow against my window at night, for the way fresh snow crunched under my black rubber boots, for the warmth of the cast iron stove as the wind screeched through the yard, the street, but mostly because as the tree froze and ice sheet the road, the chill between Baba and me thawed a little, and the reason for that was the kites. Baba and I lived in the same house but in different spheres of existence. Kites were the one paper thin slice of intersection between those spheres. Every winter district in Kabul held a kite fighting tournament, and if you were a boy living in Kabul, the day of the tournament was undeniably the highlight of the cold season. I never slept the night before the tournament. Would roll I could roll from side to side, make shadow animals on the wall, even sit on the balcony in the dark, a blanket wrapped around me. I felt like a soldier trying to sleep in the trenches the night before a major battle, and that was not so far off. In Kabul, fighting kites was a little like going to work. As with any war, you had to ready yourself for battle. For a while, Hassan and I used to build our own kites. We saved our weekly allowances in the fall, dropped the money in the little porcelain horse Baba had brought one time from Herat. When the winds of winter began to blow and snow fell in chunks, we undid the snap under the horse belly. We went to the bazaar and bought bamboo, glue, string, and paper. We spent hours every day shaving bamboo for the center and cross pairs, cutting the thin tissue paper which made for easy dipping and recovery. And then of course we had to make our own string or tar. If the kite was the gun, then tar, the glass coated cutting line, was the bullet in the chamber. We would go out in the yard and feed up the 500 feet of string through a mixture of ground glass and groove. We would then hang the line between the trees, leave it to dry. The next day we could wind the battle ready line around a wooden spool. By the time the snow melted and the rains of spring swept in, every boy in Kabul bore telltale horizontal gashes on his fingers from a whole winter of fighting kites. I remember how my classmates and I used to huddle, compare our battle scars on the first day of school. The cuts stung and did not heal for a couple of weeks, but I did not mind. They were reminders of beloved season that had once again passed too quickly. Then the class captain would blow his whistle and we could march in a single file to our classroom, longing for winter, already greeted instead by the specter of yet another long school year. But it quickly became apparent that Hassan and I were better kite fighters than kite makers. Some flaw or other in our design always spelled its doom. So Baba started taking us to Safu's to buy our kites. Safu was a nearly blind old man who was a mochi by profession, a shoe repairman, but he was also the city's most famous kite maker, working out of a tiny hole on Jada Mewand, the crowded streets south of the muddy banks of the Kabul River. I remember you had to crouch to enter the prison cell-sized store and then had to lift a trap door to creep down a set of wooden steps to the dank basement where Safu stored his covered kites. Baba would buy us each three identical kites and spouls of glassy string. If I changed my mind and asked for a bigger and fancier kite, Baba would buy it for me, but then he would buy it for Hassan too. Sometimes I wished he would not do that. Wished he would let me be the favorite. The kite fighting tournament was an old winter tradition in Afghanistan. It started early in the morning on the day of the contest and did not end until only the winning kite flew in the sky. I remember one year the tournament outlasted daylight. People gathered on sidewalks and roofs to cheer for their kids. The streets filled with the kite fighters jerking and tugging on their lines, squinting up to the sky trying to gain position to cut the opponent's line. Every kite fighter had an assistant, in my case Hassan, who held the spool and fed the line. One time a bratty Hindi kid whose family had recently moved into a neighborhood told us that in his hometown kite fighting had strict rules and regulations. You have to play in boxed area and you have to stand at the right angle to the wind, he said proudly, and you can't use aluminium to make your glass sting. Hassan and I looked at each other, cracked up. The Hindi kid would soon learn what the British learned earlier in the century and what the Russians would eventually learn by the late 1980s, that Afghans are an independent people. Afghans cherish custom but abhor rules. And so it was with kite fighting. The rules were simple: no rules, fly your kite, cut the opponent's, good luck. Except that wasn't all. The real fun began when a kite was cut. That was where the kite runners came in. Those kids who chased the wind blown kite drifting through the neighborhoods until it came spiraling down in a field, dropping in someone's yard, on a tree or a rooftop. The chase got pretty furious. Hordes of kite runners swarmed the street, shoved past each other like those people from Spain I would read about once, the ones who ran from the bulls. One year, a neighborhood kid climbed a pine tree for a kite. A branch snapped under his weight and he fell 30 feet, broke his back, and never walked again. But he fell with the kite still in his hand, and when a kite runner had his hand on a kite, no one could take it from him. That was not a rule, that was custom. For kite runner, the most coveted prize was that last fallen kite of a winter tournament. It was trophy of honor, something to be displayed on a mantle of guests to admire. When the sky cleared of kites and only the final two remained, every kite runner readied himself for the chance to land this prize. He positioned himself at a spot that he thought would give him a head start. Tense muscles readied themselves to uncoil, necks craned, eyes crinkled. Fires broke out, and when the last kite was cut, all hell broke loose. Over the years, I had been a lot of guys run kites, but Hassan was by far the greatest kite runner I had ever seen. It was downright eerie the way he always got the spot the kite would land before the kite did, as if he had some sort of inner compass. I remember one overcast winter day, Hassan and I were running a kite. I was chasing him through neighborhoods, hopping gutters, waving through narrow street. I was a year older than him, but Hassan ran faster than I did, and I was falling behind. Hassan, wait! I yelled, my breathing hot and raged. He whirled around, motioned with his hand. This way, he called before dashing around another corner. I looked up, saw that the direction we were running was opposite to the one of the kite was drifting. We are losing it. We are going the wrong way, I cried out. Trust me, I heard him call up ahead. I reached the corner and saw Hassan bolting along, his head down, not even looking at the sky, sweat soaking through the back of his shirt. I tripped over a rock and fell. I was not just slower than Hassan, but clumsier too. I could always envy his natural athleticism. When I staggered to my feet, I caught a glimpse of Hassan disappearing around another street corner. I hobbled after him, spikes of pain battering my scrapped knee. I saw we had ended up on a rutted dirt road near Istiklal Middle School. There was a field on one side where lettuce grew in the summer and a row of sour cherry trees on the other. I found Hassan sitting cross-legged at the foot of one of the trees, eating from a fistful of dried mulberries. What are we doing here? I panted, my stomach roiling with nausea. He smiled. Sit with me, Amiraga. I dropped next to him, lay on the thin patch of snow, whizzing. You are wasting our time. It was going to the other way. Didn't you see? Hassan popped a mulberry in his mouth. It's coming, he said. I could hardly breathe, and he did not even sound tired. How do you know? I said. I know. How can you know? He turned to me. A few sweet beads rolled from his bald scalp. Would I ever lie to you, Amir Agha? Suddenly I decided to toy with him a little. I don't know, would you? I would sooner eat dirt, he said with a look of indignation. Really? You could do that? He threw me a puzzled look. Do what? Eat dirt if I told you to, I said. I knew I was being cruel like when I would taunt him if he did not know some big word, but there was something fascinating, albeit in a sick way, about teasing Hassan, kind of like when we used to play insect torture, except now he was the ant and I was holding the magnifying glass. His eyes searched my face for a long time, but we sat there, two boys under a sour cherry tree, suddenly really looking at each other. That's when it happened again. Hassan's face changed. Maybe not changed, not really, but suddenly I had the feeling I was looking at two faces. The one I knew, the one that was my first memory, and another, a second face. This one lurking just beneath the surface. I had seen it happen before. It always shook me up a little. It just appeared, this other face, for a fraction of a moment, long enough to leave me with the settling feeling that maybe I had been it someplace before. Then Hassan blinked, and it was just him again, just Hassan. If If you asked, I would, he finally said, looking right at me. I dropped my eyes. To this day, I find it hard to gaze directly at the people like Hassan, people who mean every word they say. But I wonder, he added, would you ever ask me to do such thing, Amiraga? And just like that, he had thrown at me his own little test. If I was going to toy with him and challenge his loyalty, then he could toy with me, test my integrity. I wished I had not started this conversation. I forced a smile. Don't be stupid, Hassan. You know I would not. Hassan returned the smile, except his didn't look forced. I know, he said, and that's the thing about people who mean everything they say. They think everyone else does too. Here it comes, Hassan said, pointing to the sky. He rose to his feet and walked a few paces to his left. I looked up, saw the kite plummeting Toward us, I heard footfalls, shouts, and approaching melee of kite runners, but they were wasting their time because Hassan stood with his arms wide open, smiling, waiting for the kite. And may God, if he exists, that is strike me blind if the kite did not just drop into his outstretched arms. In the winter of 1975, I saw Hassan run a kite for the last time. Usually, each neighborhood held its own competition, but that year the tournament was going to be held in my neighborhood. Wazir Akbar Khan and the several other districts, Karte Char, Karte Parwan, Makro Rayan, and Kote Sangi, had been invited. You could hardly go anywhere without hearing talk of the upcoming tournament. Word had it this was going to be the biggest tournament in 25 years. One night that winter, with the big contest only 4 days away, Baba and I sat in his study in our stuffed leather chairs by the glow of the fireplace. We were sipping tea, talking. Ali had served dinner earlier, potatoes and curried cauliflower over rice, and had retired for the night with Hassan. Baba was fattening his pipe, and I was asking him to tell the story about the winter a pack of wolves had descended from the mountains in Herat and forced everyone to stay indoors for a week. When he lit a match and said casually, I think maybe you will win the tournament this year. What do you think? I didn't know what to think or what to say. Was that what it would take? Had he just slipped me a key? I was good kite fighter, actually a very good one. A few times I could even come close to the winning the winter tournament. Once I had made it to the final three, but coming close was not the same as winning, was it? Baba had not come close. He had won because winners won and everyone else just went home. Baba was used to winning at everything. He set his mind to. Didn't he have to accept the same from his son? And just imagine if I did win. Baba smoked his pipe and talked. I pretended to listen, but I could not listen, not really, because Baba's casual little comment had planted a seed in my head. The resolution that I would win that winter's tournament. I was going to win. There was no other viable option. I was going to win and I was going to run that last kite. Then I could bring it home, and I would bring it home and show it to Baba, show him once and for all that his son was worthy. Then maybe my life as a ghost in his house would finally be over. I let myself dream. I imagined conversation and laughter over dinner instead of silence broken only by the clinking of silverware and the occasional grunt. I envisioned us taking a Friday drive in Baba's car to Pagman, stopping on the way at Garga Lake for some fried trout and potatoes. We could go to the zoo to see Marjan the lion, and the maybe Babas would not yawn and still looks at his wristwatch all the time. Maybe Baba would even read one of my stories. Could write him 100 if I thought he would read one. Maybe he could call me a Amir Jan like Rahim Khan did, and maybe, just maybe, I would finally be pardoned for killing my mother. Baba was telling me about the time he had cut 14 kites on the same day. I smiled, nodded, laughed at all the right places, but I hardly heard a word he said. I had a mission now, and I was not going to fail Baba, not this time. It snowed heavily the night before this tournament. Hassan and I sat under the kursi and played punch par as wind rattled. Tree branches tapped on the window. Earlier that day, I I had asked Ali to set up the kursi for us, which was basically an electric heater under a low table covered with a thick quilted blanket. Around the table, he arranged mattresses and cushions so as many as 20 people could sit and sleep their legs under. Hassan and I used to spend entire snowy days snug under the kursi playing chess, card, mostly punch bar. I killed Hassan's 10th of diamonds, played him 2 jacks and a 6. Next door in Baba's studies, Baba and Rahim Khan were discussing business with a couple of other men. One of them I recognized as Asif's father. Through the wall, I could hear the scratchy sound of Radio Kabul news. Hassan killed the 6 and picked up the jacks. On the radio, Daud Khan was announcing something about foreign investment. He says someday we will have television in Kabul. Said who? I said who? Daud Khan, US, the president. Hassan giggled. I heard they already have it in Iran. He said. I sighed. Those Iranians, for a lot of Hazaras, Iran represented us sanctuary of sorts. I guess because, like Hazaras, most Iranians were Shia Muslim, but I remembered something my teacher had said that summer about Iranians that they were grinning smooth talkers who patted you on the back with one hand and picked your pocket with the other. I told Baba about that, and he said my teacher was one of those jealous Afghans, jealous because Iran was a rising power in Asia and most people around the world could not even find Afghanistan on a world map. It hurts to say that, he said, shrugging, but better to get hurt by the truth than comforted with a lie. I will buy you one someday, I said. Hassan's face brightened. A television in truth, sure, and not the black and white kind either. We will probably be grown ups by then, but I will get us two. One for you and one for me. I will put it on my table where I keep my drawing, Hassan said. His saying that made me kind of sad for who Hassan was, where he lived, for how he had accepted the fact that he would grow old in that mud shack in the yard the way his father had. I drew the last card, played him a pair of queens and a 10. Hassan picked up the queens. You know, I think you are going to make Agha Sahab very proud tomorrow. You think so? Inshallah, he said. Inshallah, I echoed, though the God willing qualifier didn't sound as sincere coming from my lips. That was the thing with Hassan. He was so goddamn pure. You always felt like a phony around him. I killed his king and played him my final card, the ace of spades. He had to pick it up. I had won, but as I shuffled for a new game, I had the distinct suspicion that the Hassan had let me win. Amir Agha, what you know, I like where I live. He was always doing that, reading my mind. It's my home. Whatever, I said, get ready to lose again.